Good morning, everyone. We're so glad to see the large turnout for our speaker. And with no ado, I'd like to introduce Davis Hammet. And rather than listen to me, I want you to be able to have every second with him to ask questions. Davis?
All right, so when I pulled up, I actually was wondering if I was in the wrong place because there were so many cars out front. I was like, this can't be a civic engagement event. So my name is Davis Hammet. I mean, when I was asked to talk about everyday activism, that's kind of my life. I guess it started, I'm the youngest of 5. So being a youngest child, if there's anyone else in the room who is a youngest child, it's kind of just an act of being an activist, right? Pleading for the redress of grievances to your parents. Whenever I was in 4th grade, I became a vegetarian and started working on animal rights and laid my body across a Burger King drive-thru. That was okay. So it really wasn't a surprise, actually, when the police called my parents to come pick me up from that situation. As things went on, I got into environmental organizing in college. I was recruited to work with a group called Repower America. And just completely by accident. A friend was like, hey, I know you care about this issue. Do you want to take this side gig in college? And I worked with college students. I would go and talk with them about why they cared about transitioning to renewable energy and just kind of building consensus on that topic and all the implications of it. And then out of college, I had a friend who asked me if I would come work with him with the nonprofit he had called Planning Peace. I was like, all right, I'll do that for a couple months to pay my good deed to society, and then I'll go into like the for-profit world. And then I moved to New York City. I started working with them doing raising funds to get international relief programs going, so getting deworming programs in Guatemala and Haiti, places like that. And then a couple months into that, I was asked if I would be interested in moving to Kansas to create a rainbow house across from the notorious Westboro Baptist hate group. Which was not something, to be completely honest, I did not know where Kansas was on a map. I just knew it was somewhere in the middle, and my main perception of it was, all the stereotypes like Wizard of Oz, which I have now also grown to hate. And the Westboro Baptist Church, to be honest. And one thing about coming here that still surprises me is that when I arrived in January of 2013, was that everyone I was meeting, even just talking to the clerk at the gas station, everyone seemed so different than the politics that were coming out of the state. And really wondering, what is that divide? Because no one seems to agree with what's happening in the State House. Yet somehow the people are getting reelected and they're there. So I'm going to step back for a second now, and I want to talk about the Equality House, because when we think about everyday activism, I think there's always these perceptions, right, of the national stories you hear about people who dedicate their life to it. But one thing that I loved about being a part of creating the Equality House is it's really, all it is it's paint. It's just paint on a house. But for so many people, it means so many different things. We would get letters from teenagers who said it got them to stop cutting themselves. Or they, and even because maybe they saw it on the news and then they hear their parents have a conversation about it and they realize that maybe their parents aren't homophobic. There's all sorts of things that came out of this symbol that we never expected, and it became a powerful symbol to people. But I even think symbols can be things like, if you're having a really, really bad day, and randomly a stranger smiles at you and it kind of like forces you to absorb that and smile back, right? I would consider that a form of activism. You don't know how those tiny deeds that you are doing every day are encouraging people to, just do the radical act of living another day in what can sometimes be a very dreadful, overwhelming world. So doing the Equality House, I started going around, working on college campuses, mobilizing people, going to protest. The first protest I went to at the beginning of January, or this was I think March of 2013. It was International Working Women's Day, and I went to the Capitol thinking, all right, I'm new in Kansas, I'm going to make all these new friends there at this protest, and there were 5 people. And I quickly realized, going to several protests at the Capitol, that in 2013, basically no one was protesting at the Capitol. And what I now understand is that really after 2010, we saw kind of an exodus. A lot of activists burn out. A lot of engagement just died down. People either fled the state or they just kept their head low. And so one thing that I really wanted to do was be a part of helping to rebuild that. Right? So just convincing friends like, hey, I know there's only 5 people at the protest, but be one more person. And I know that maybe you're working on the one issue in your neighborhood, in your community, but like, what if you showed up for other people's issue? And that's kind of my #1 piece of advice to anyone who wants to get involved, because everyone thinks like, hey, I have the solution to this problem, and everyone should get behind me. And what I've realized is that's the complete wrong way to go about it. You might not even know the issues that you're really passionate about until you start showing up for other people and hearing about their lives and about their struggles, and it will give you a deeper purpose. So, finding myself constantly at women's rights events, at racial justice events, at environmental events, whatever it was, and I started to grow as a person as I took on other people's causes. So that's kind of my #1 advice for everyday activism, is show up for other people and their causes. Because then it's also, you're building a relationship, right? All organizing, all work, all of being a person, really. I mean, we're human beings, and it's about relationships. A community is just a series of relationships. And when you show up for other people, you hear their stories, you hear their struggles, they hear yours, they're going to show up for you. One thing for me about this was whenever we were going through so many education cuts, around 2013, 2014, and activists from Johnson County, moms and teachers, started walking to Topeka, right, as a protest. And Heather Owsley had done that, and then it built, and then there were several people doing that. And I think there needs to be massive reforms in education. I didn't imagine that I'd be fighting for the existence of public education. That was really the battle we were having. It wasn't how to go about it, should we reform it? It was, is public education a right as an American, as a Kansan? And so I went, and I think it was the first year I knew about it, I walked the last little bit. The next year I walked an entire day. And then the 2 years after that, I did the entire walk with him. And lo and behold, as a queer person, when I was having LGBT protests, who was it that I could always rely on to show up? Sometimes even more than the LGBTQ community itself. It was moms with kids in public education, and teachers would always be the people to show up for us because we were showing up for them. So building that solidarity of people. The other thing that I think about when I think about activism and how to go about it is power. We really don't have a good conversation about power going. And power is always viewed as this evil thing, right? All of us are constantly yielding power and going through the river of power and choosing how to shape that. And one thing that really defines power to me is proximity. Where are you in proximity to the power or the thing that you're trying to change? So when we talk about, writing letters, if you're writing a letter, you're trying to get your story, your voice, your opinion in front of them. If you call them, you're doing the same thing. If you show up, you're doing the same thing. But also proximity works like, if in all honesty, I think if we wanted to really end homelessness in America, if every U.S. senator opened their door and if there was a homeless person asleep on their doorstep every day, we would end homelessness in America. But what they do is they make laws and rules to push it out of their sight. I'm originally from North Florida. I'm from a beach resort town in North Florida, far away from here. But they literally pass laws that just criminalize homelessness in the city, and police will pick up homeless folks and drive them an hour north of our beach town and then just kick them out. It's not even legal, but it's common practice, not because they care about homelessness or they want to deal with it, they just want to intentionally remove it out of people's sight so that people don't have to confront those realities. So when you put reality in front of politicians' faces, right? Like whenever you bring that struggle and that story into the face of power, they have to confront it. As we know, the walk for education, the politicians had to constantly see it, and people were showing up in their offices, and they were doing it, and they started calling teachers the red coats, right? Because they would just fill the galleries with red shirts. But they put that story, they know that they were reminding politicians as they took the votes that they were there. Another thing that I think about is how many of you have been in the State House while session is going on? Can you raise your hand? All right, so outside the chamber doors, you'll always see a group of professionally dressed people just hovering around, out like sharks, right? Like just outside the chamber's doors. And all those are professional lobbyists. And there's a reason that no matter what's going on, they are right outside that door. Because no matter what happens, they want the politicians to see their face before they go in to take votes, because it reminds them of the conversations that they've had, right? So no matter what, last night they were debating the budget. There were plenty of other lobbyist groups that had nothing to do with the budget, and they're still sitting in the gallery because they want to make sure that if anything comes up related to what they care about, the politicians look back and see their face and knows what their special interest is. Now that special interest too, we think of lobbyists and we always think of it as inherently bad, right? That can also be you. Last night, late at night, for those of you who don't know, there's now basically a standoff going off between the House and the Senate over the House's refusing to pass a budget until the Senate passes Medicaid expansion. And there's kind of like a civil war going on within the Republican Party in the House that got really intense last night, where it was literally half of the Republican Party versus half of the Republican Party on that vote. But with that, late at night, as they were going to do that vote, people started flooding in and filling the gallery. Again, those politicians are looking back, and it reminds them, especially for them that they know, oh, that's my constituent that I've talked to, and I know they really care about this issue. They're now looking back and they have that encouragement. Because again, politicians are just people, and they operate in the same world you do. They care about their friends, you care about your family, you care about the stories you've heard, and when you're reminded of those things, that's how you vote. On voting rights, which is something that I never imagined that I would be living in Kansas, working on the nuances of voting policy at a state level. In 2013, January of 2013 was kind of an odd time to arrive, because I arrived on the month that Chris Kobach's signature voter suppression tactic was beginning to take place. It was submitting a birth certificate, but it wasn't just a birth certificate. It was a documented birth certificate, which means that it's like it has to come directly from the state, and it can be a really, really difficult process to get an out-of-state documentary birth certificate. I'm sure if any of you did voter registration before, well, that was a process. It could be weeks and weeks and weeks. You basically had to be a caseworker with someone to get them registered to vote. One thing that was interesting about that, though, was that it didn't apply to anyone who was already registered to vote. It only applied to new registrants, so it only applied to mostly young people. And really, essentially what they did is they liked the 2010 and 2012 electorate, and they froze it. They really froze out who was allowed to vote. They said, we like the voters this year, we're not going to let anyone else vote. And that was the implication, as we know it was, by the time that it got overturned, it was suppressing over 40,000 people from voting. Almost exclusively young people from voting. So now we know, now that we had a couple years where that was in hold, and then we could use the federal form, and then now the judge has just ruled that it violated the Constitution, which means that the 2014 election, which saw Kansas become the most one-sided government it has ever been in its history, where 80% of both chambers of the legislature were controlled by one party and dominated by the fringe of that party, that was an unconstitutional election. I want you to think about the power of that. That violated the United States Constitution, the election that happened in 2014, because it was suppressing tens of thousands of people from voting. It was the bogus legislature. So now going forward, now that we won that, now that we have that court case, and hopefully, the state will not win its appeal, we hope. But now we have that, so now we look at things that I know y'all are familiar with in Johnson County, like the mail ballot fiasco that just happened in the primary. The Republican primary in 2018 for governor was the closest statewide election in Kansas history. And now we know that hundreds and hundreds, potentially thousands and thousands of votes were wrongfully not counted. And in that case, we have the situation of where they got ballots where just a random poll worker decided, I don't think that signature matches, and was able to throw out the ballot without ever contacting the voter to tell them, just to call and say, hey, I don't think your signature matches, was that really you? Or even, hey, can you come in and show that that was you? So now, luckily, I tried to object to the nomination of Chris Kobach on that, and I went in front of a panel. We have a pretty questionable panel system where basically 3 operatives that worked for Chris Kobach got to decide if that election was legitimate. But in any case, we were able to raise awareness of that and several other issues, and really that in Kansas, depending on what county you live in, is the likelihood of your vote being counted. There are different standards being used county to county. For example, y'all had, I think it was, y'all had 150 or so votes thrown out for signature mismatch here. Sedgwick County, where Wichita is, similar size, 0 were thrown out for that reason. So now, luckily, though, this issue got brought up, and the legislature did pass with overwhelming bipartisan support. Now it is the law of the land, where if they believe your signature mismatched, or if your ballot is just missing a signature, they have to try to contact you at least twice and give you the opportunity to correct that issue. Which is, yeah. So now on the next frontier, again, as we try to get closer and closer to that ideal of one person, one vote, making sure that every legitimate ballot cast is counted, the number one thing we could do, which unfortunately was completely blocked in committee, is create same-day voter registration. Yeah. It is across the nation, it is the number one thing we know we can do to increase turnout. On average, it's 9 to 11%, meaning 10% total turnout increase. That's incredible. And again, it's mostly young people. And when we talk about youth voter turnout, I think that it gets really politicized and whatever, and we're talking about, do young people feel invested in their community? And when I talk to rural lawmakers about voting rights, I'm asking that, why would an 18-year-old stay in a small rural town when you won't even let them vote? What investment do they have in the future? Because that's what voting and that's what civic engagement is about. It's about investing your time and your being in the future of your community. So while we did not get that through, we're going to continue to fight that. And what's really interesting about this system is Kansas actually lets anyone cast a provisional ballot. So every year we have thousands and thousands and thousands of people that show up on election day. You have to cast a provisional ballot, you fill out a voter registration form. So they fill out the voter registration form, they cast their provisional ballot. Then the elections officials just take the voter registrations and they process them. They get added to the voter registration rolls for future elections. So they aren't saying like, oh, this is voter fraud or whatever. They're saying, no, these are legitimate citizens that want to be registered. But then they take their votes and they throw them away because they didn't get registered 21 days before the election. In this case, too, we have situations where plenty of them are people who turned 18 after that registration deadline. I work on college campuses. I've had people tell me, I can't vote this year. I turned 18 2 days before the election, and aren't even aware that they are able to pre-register, and their right to vote shouldn't depend on if I get in front of them and kind of like, I'm like, no, you can't get registered to vote. Tons of people fall into this gap, and more nefarious and problematic than that gap is in Kansas, so we take away felons' right to vote, but once they're off the paper, meaning they finish their time, they're off parole, they're off probation, they restore their right to vote. There are people who their rights are restored after the registration deadline, but before Election Day. So it would be illegal for them to register to vote, but it is technically legal for them to be registered and voting on Election Day. That's just wrong. And it's an oversight, and the election registration deadline is an obscure, nonsensical deadline at this point. So really, I guess I kind of just want to open it up to questions from y'all. That's my favorite part of doing stuff like this, because I want to know what y'all want to hear. So yeah, I'll just kind of...
Yeah, the Kansas legislature recently passed a bill that said you can opt into voting anywhere in the county as opposed to your particular precinct. What happens if you don't opt in is that if you move within the county more than 30 days prior to the election, your vote won't count because you voted in the wrong precinct. So help us understand why Ronnie Metzger has not opted in and why, what the cost is. I recently had the county chairman tell me it would cost $200,000 to institute and opt in. I'm just curious, since when you vote in advance, you can be from any precinct. Can you help us understand that?
Yeah. Okay. So the question is about, so recently Kansas passed a law that county election officials can opt into a system where on election day, citizens can go vote at any polling place. And this was pushed by Sedgwick County's commissioner, that in Sedgwick County is very excited to implement this. And Ronnie Metzger says that they will not implement this. So that's the question. So I guess kind of what's up with that? I should start with the disclosure that I have sued Ronnie Metzger. And the American Civil Liberties Union represented me in that case, and we won. And that was over this disclosure of provisional ballots, them having to disclose why they're throwing out every ballot, which was a really big win. And unfortunately, when we started calling people whose ballots were thrown out, some of them were Republican precinct people who personally know Ronnie Metzger and were very upset to learn that their votes were thrown out and they were never informed. So on this policy, so this actually came out of kind of nowhere. This wasn't on my radar. I don't know anyone's radar. This was something Tabitha Lehman, who is the Sedgwick County Commissioner, Elections Commissioner, who was a KOBOC appointee. She was a KOBOC appointee, and then I remember several years ago her coming in and really almost driven to tears. She was giving testimony, and she said, "I'm just scared that I'm suppressing people from their vote." And she, watching her take on that role and then her grow in that role and go from kind of being appointed by KOBOC to becoming a voting rights advocate, where she's come up and really pushed for better election laws. So she came and she introduced this law and she fought for this law. And really for them in Sedgwick County, the big issue was people who work at aviation plants, which are kind of on the outskirts of town. And they work very long hours in these aviation plants, and she wanted them to be able to vote at the polling places right next to where they get off work, instead of having to drive, they might miss it when they drive into town. So for her, this made sense, and it works mostly on electronic voting machines. Basically, they just have a code, the person can enter it, and it can pull up the ballot. I don't know why Ronnie Metzger is opposed to this. I do know that, or at least the rumor in the Capitol was there was only a couple votes against it. Senator Mary Pilcher Cook was the only state senator to vote against it. And my understanding is that was at the kind of urging of Ronnie Metzger, because he thought if they made this optional program that his constituents would want it to be implemented, and he didn't want to implement it. I mean, my understanding from Ronnie Metzger is y'all had to wait years and years to get new electronic machines so that you could get these new advanced electronic machines which are completely capable of doing this, which is why y'all spent $15 million on them. So, I mean, I don't know why you would withhold it. I do think there are some logistical difficulties about it, right? Like, you do have to program this, you do have to train people, but every year they do training. Election law is complicated. I would also encourage y'all, if you would like to be a poll worker on election day, they need you. They really do struggle to recruit enough people to be running poll stations. But this is something where, if you want to continue to pressure him on it, it is completely at his discretion. It's very possible to do. Y'all are the largest county, and if y'all want it to happen, you should be able to make it happen. But, really, it's just he said he doesn't want to do the work to install it. That's really been this situation that we have, is he just isn't interested in implementing it. But it is optional county to county.
Well, just continuing on with the Ronnie Metzger thing, why is that a appointed position, and how long's the term? And will he be reappointed? And why is it that everyone in here knows his name? Isn't that kind of an unusual situation?
It is an interesting thing whenever regular people know government bureaucrats' names. It's usually only because of problems. So it is a 4-year appointment. It was actually one of Chris Kobach's final acts that he reappointed Ronnie Metzger to another 4 years. Why? So how we have it set up in Kansas is every county, usually their county clerk runs elections. And county clerks are elected positions. So the county gets to vote on their county clerk who runs all the filings. They're basically like a local Secretary of State. They deal with all the business filings and stuff like that and run elections. In the Kansas Constitution, I believe, it's that if it has over 125,000 residents in a county, then they get an elections commissioner. And the goal of this makes sense. It's more difficult to run big elections, so there would be an independent elections department to run this. How those have been appointed has changed throughout the years. They've had things where they have to be confirmed by the Senate. They've had things where different executive level branches appoint it. But now where it is the Secretary of State basically has absolute discretion to appoint whoever they want to those top elections jobs. It has always blown my mind that we have, University of Kansas has one of the nation's top public administrations, graduate programs. How do we not just have public administration officials who are professionals at this stuff running our elections? Ronnie Metzger's main credential is basically that he was the head of the Johnson County Republican Party, and he supported Chris Kobach, and so he got that job. And it's a political appointment, and that's really just kind of how it is right now. There has been a push instead to allow it to be a political appointment, to make it that instead it would either be confirmed by the Senate, or that people would be able to vote for their own elections commissioner. Really, like all structures of government, the problem is, in some ways, it doesn't matter how they get there. It's about who appoints them, right? So is it really that bad to have a Secretary of State appoint them? It doesn't really matter unless you have a Secretary of State who does these as completely political appointments instead of good appointments. So that is a push. We could see it go either way, but right now, y'all have Ronnie Metzger for another 4 years. You could petition to Scott Schwab to have that, appointment withdrawn, which is possible, or you could, there has been a movement in the legislature, though, to try to make this instead a county-appointed thing, because it is only the larger counties that don't get the right to appoint their own elections commissioner. Every other county has that. One thing that is kind of interesting and a little bit in the weeds is after the next census, there's a chance that Douglas County will become a elections commissioner county. And so instead of being able to elect their own county clerk, which they love their county clerk in, Jamie Hsu is probably the best county clerk in the state, and he might lose his job after the census because the people won't be able to elect him anymore. The Secretary of State will be able to appoint them. But that is, I mean, that's a government policy. It could be changed. You could request that y'all actually be able to vote on your own elections commissioner.
Use the microphone, please. Thank you.
What is the argument for not having same-day voter registration?
So the argument for not having same-day voter registration would be, I mean, the kind of, the false flag that we always see go up, voter fraud, right? This was, I mean, it was really incredible sitting in the committee room watching them go through, because they actually had, the county clerks were getting up and being like, yeah, this would actually be fine, the system they're proposing. Because what we were proposing is some counties do it where you can just walk in, you register, and you can go cast a normal ballot. In Kansas, we understand it's Kansas, right? Kansas always does things like a little more calm about everything. And so what I was advocating for, and what basically everyone kind of came to consensus on, was the goal was going to be that they still do this system where they cast a provisional ballot, and they're fill out their voter registration form. But then the county clerk would be able to take the next week or so to look at those voter registrations, make sure that there's no reason not to process them, right? Make sure no one's an active felon or something like that, and then count them. So we were just going to use this system where the county clerk would have time to check, just to verify, hey, there's no other reason not to accept these voter registration forms, which is a very conservative way to do same-day voter registration. But still, it went around, and then, I mean, some of the kind of far-right legislators that opposed this, they waited, right? They didn't talk the entire time. And even county clerks got up and said that they supported it with this compromise language and everything. And then it was just right at the end, right before the vote, we just heard like, voter fraud, I don't think my elections clerk wants it, and then it just voted down. Because it happened in the committee process. I mean, there's another good chance that if it made it to the floor, I could easily see it passing. But as we know, for anyone who's not familiar, we basically, any bill, whenever it gets introduced, it goes to a committee. The makeup of that committee can just, decide the fate of that. Actually, the chair of the committee can decide to never have a hearing, and I do appreciate Representative Chair of Elections Sutton allowed a hearing on this, conducted what I thought was a very fair hearing, because you have sometimes chairs who call themselves strong chairs, and they basically just shut down and will fight with conferees and things like that. But they had a good hearing, but then it was just, really the committee was stacked with conservatives. In part, the speaker put conservatives there knowing that people would try to pass election laws that were decent, but it died there, and there was really no vehicle to pull it up on the floor. Like so many things in the legislature, the majority probably supports this policy. But leadership and a few people in leadership positions on the committee were able to kill it. What was interesting about that, though, is Blake Carpenter, Representative Carpenter, who was strongly opposed to same-day voter registration, when he was asked about this other bill that Sedgwick wanted, he's a Sedgwick County representative, the bill that we talked about earlier where you can go in and vote at any polling place on Election Day, he strongly supported that bill. And Representative Parker, when it ran around, he was like, oh, Representative Carpenter, that was a really great argument for same-day registration. Because he was saying, he's like, we have the technology. They can verify right there that we're ready for this. I think it really is a partisan thing for whatever reason. Some politicians do not like the idea of letting young people vote. And as we saw in Dodge and stuff, some politicians also don't like the idea of letting people of color vote. We also saw in some of the voter suppression tactics Kobach used, they also targeted married women, where they would have to have affidavits explaining why their birth certificate last name is different than their ID. The arguments aren't substantial. And that was the thing. It was really shown. When you have the county clerk saying, yeah, we can do this, this makes sense, arguments were not substantial.
Sorry. Could you talk a little bit about Loud Light and the organization that you lead and the efforts? Thank you. I enjoy supporting monetarily Loud Light, and I appreciate the work that you do, and I'd encourage you all to. don't know if I'm supposed to say that or not, but I'm saying it. But I've heard you talk before about some of the work specifically that you've done on college campuses, and can you tell us a little bit more about the narrative that changes on a college campus versus other places?
So I swear that she wasn't planted in the audience. I think I'm probably really bad at raising money, where whenever I go and talk, someone from the audience is like, hey, by the way, you should help. So Loud Light started in 2015, and this was really right after the 2014 election, whenever I realized that I was looking at election data, and at that time, the 2014 election, Kansas was in the bottom 5 in the nation for youth turnout. And I really realized that no matter what the issue was, until basically my generation started participating in civics, these things weren't going to change, right? Because when we talk about LGBT rights, environmental concerns, other issues like young folks are with it, basically, right? So I wanted to work on voter registration. In 2016, it was really just me running around on college campuses by myself with a couple friends every now and then coming and volunteering, trying to weigh people down and get them registered to vote. And then in 2017, at the end of 2016, we started working on the Kansas People's Agenda with several other groups, really going around getting input from lots of Kansans and kind of making this solidarity agenda of saying, again, like, you'll show up for me, I'll show up for you. And that's when, at the first week of the 2017 session, we had a big protest in the Capitol with lots of people from lots of different groups coming together, and it was a really powerful moment. But at the end of that week, I was kind of wondering, I was like, so many people won't even know that this happened, and so many people don't even know what's going on in the State House. And at this time, I was really worried because they were talking about securitizing the CIF, which is the Children's Initiative Fund, which is basically, a while ago, Kansas won a big tobacco lawsuit, and instead of just taking that money and throwing it into the general fund and letting it disappear, the state of Kansas did something that was written about by governing magazines and stuff. It took all that money and it put it in a trust where it could only be used for young children's programs. And with that, it has a board and everything, and it's a really innovative, great program because it keeps everyone's, greasy fingers from getting into it, and it only goes to early childhood programs. The Brownback administration had proposed that first week, they wanted to securitize it. Basically, for years and years, we'll get that money, and they wanted to just sell off the entire thing for a one-time check, just to fill a budget hole. And it would have created a long-term problem because now there would be no money to fund all these early childhood intervention programs. And so I wanted people to know about that too, right? So I took my laptop webcam and I went in the corner of my bedroom and I just opened it up and I made this I was like, hey, this happened, this happened, this happened. I opened up the free software on my computer to edit a video and threw in some graphics. And then I just edited it and I was like, hey, if this was helpful, let me know. Maybe I'll do it again next week. And then it just took off. Like it just went everywhere and all these people were very encouraging. And so I was like, all right, I guess I'll do it next week. And every week I tried to get better and better at it. And I started teaching myself video editing and graphics and all that stuff. And then it was at when we were going into this, really the special session, it was extended. That was whenever it got to the point where they were like, okay, we either have to override the tax experiment or the state's screwed. Basically, there was no way to get out of it. No one knew how to make money appear. There was just no more money. And I spent a couple months doing research in the library, and I did this big piece on the budget crisis, putting it in like a 100-year perspective, right? And then it took off, and it got over 250,000 views, which to my surprise, the vast majority of those views were 18 to 29-year-olds watching like a 9-minute video on complex economic policy. So that became a pillar too. And then in 2016, we did more and more voter registration, and then that's grown. And now this year, we had a 3-day training with college students. We had a dozen college students working on campuses across the state, and we registered around, I think it was just about 2,700 college students in Kansas this past fall before the election. And then we also had a huge get out the vote push, right? So we also had students going around on election day and before, informing people, helping them make a plan and everything. So really the Loud Light has become what it really started, and kind of the bread and butter is still being on college campuses, talking to young people, getting them to register, and having really college students talking to college students about why they should vote and like their issues, right? And we talk about getting them to understand that there are several colleges that have districts where the state representative is won by, less than 50 votes. That happens. And explaining to them, like, the president doesn't decide your tuition and how much debt you're going to be in for the rest of your life. Your state representative does. Those are state policies. And getting them to think about these things that everyone pushes off on the president. And I'll tell them straight up, I'm like, your vote for president doesn't matter. Like, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know that's an unpopular thing, but I'm like, we're in Kansas. It's probably not going to have impact. But I was like, your vote for state representative might decide all these things that completely impact your life. We'll decide the quality of your water. We'll decide how much debt you're in for the rest of life. If you hit that pothole every day, whatever it is these local and state elections that are really powerful. And also gearing up now, going into 2019, as you all know, as the league, getting people engaged in local elections is the hardest thing. I mean, it's that absurdity of, again, proximity to power. There's nothing more close in proximity to you than your street, than your neighborhood, than your city. But that's the place where no one pays attention to. And especially young people don't pay attention to local politics. So what we want to work on now and kind of going forward is making more resources to explain why these issues matter to young people, right? Getting them to stop spending every waking moment talking about presidential politics. Get engaged, go to a city council meeting, find out about an issue to push. Any issue you care about at a national level can be addressed at a local level. As we know from some people here right now, you can take on climate change. It really starts in your neighborhood, in your cities. All these issues that we think of as too big for us to deal with start really locally and really small. So that's what Loud Light's become. It's about making digestible information that helps people stay engaged, getting young people registered to vote, and then building coalitions that help kind of activists talk to each other and work with each other and help each other out.
I am also not a plant, but I love Loud Light, and I have to say that that's what keeps me sane. I don't know what is going on in the legislature. We post Loud Light on our Facebook page, and it's fabulous. And we just posted the Medicaid expansion Loud Light video that Davis did, and so that's my statement. There is also a very nice donate button I believe at the end of each video, which I do click. But what currently is going on in the legislature with Medicaid expansion and the budget? Last night I was trying to follow it, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. But so in a conference committee, what is the agree to disagree? What's that all about? I don't understand it.
So first off, don't feel stupid about that, because all the legislators were like running around like, wait, what is this? Can we do this? Because, what really happens in this veto session, and because everything, the normal process, the first couple months, they're really doing nothing. And this year, it was historically doing nothing. Articles were written about how few bills were being discussed or worked. They kept on having informational hearings, where when they're supposed to be debating and working bills, they just have someone come in and just talk about stuff. This session has been absurd. There's definitely some growing pains of they're not used to having, plenty of these people only operated under one party's governor, so there's kind of like this power dynamic and power struggle. But with the conference committee reports, basically where we're at is normal bills are done. And they call them shells, where they basically have bill numbers that they aren't allowed to introduce new bills, so they just, what we kind of call like gut and go, it's really like shells. They basically just take bill numbers of existing bills that have passed both chambers or one chamber, and they just put whatever they want into it. And they only have so many vehicles or shells they can do that with, and those things become conference committee reports, which normally a conference committee is like whenever both sides pass a bill, but they had a minor disagreement, and they're supposed to come together and they debate, are we going to take your side or our side, or are we going to meet somewhere in the middle? And then that bill, now called a conference committee report, goes to each side, and they can't really, they can't amend it or anything, they can just vote up or down, right? They just say, do we agree or disagree with what the conference committee did? Now, the conference committees they have 3 members from each chamber. On the relevant committee, they have the ranking member, the vice chair, and the chair, right? So they have basically 2 Republicans and a Democrat. Now, what happens is, so there's 6 people, 4 Republicans, 2 Democrats. What often happens is they do an agree to disagree, which they basically say the conference committee, all 6 of them can't agree on it, so can we just kick off the Democrats? So that's what that does. An agree to disagree says we don't have to negotiate with the Democrats anymore on this issue. So basically what happens is they go through and they're like, they do an agree to disagree, which they need a simple majority to do. Then they're able to kick off the Democrats, like this happened last night with the budget bill. So they ran that, they kick off the Democrats, and then they go and they pass their version of the bill, and then it comes to the floor to debate. Now, as you'll see some legislators say, which is true, like the agree to disagree is a procedural move, right? So it's a little complicated how you view it. There are plenty of people last night who voted for the agree to disagree. Plenty of Republicans voted for the agree to disagree. But then when the bill came out, they voted against that budget bill. So it is a nuanced procedural thing. There was some discussion of like there being a motion to reconsider one of the earlier versions from the conference committee, and everyone was running around being like, can you do that? Turns out you can't, but no one knew, right? And I think that really what it speaks to is how broken this process is right now, right? Like, also, we're still supposed to have 2 more weeks of the veto session. There's not like this crisis, we're not up against a wall. There's no reason that they should be even going into, I mean, they're gaveling in 5 minutes ago. There's no, I mean, and they're immediately gaveling out to take a break, by the way. We'll probably start at like 11. But there's no reason for this to be happening. I mean, it's obvious that people are really passionate about Medicaid expansion. The Senate should have just allowed a vote a month ago. I mean, school funding and Medicaid expansion could have been passed the first week. Everyone knew where they stood on the issue. It could have been done. But instead, we have this kind of artificial crisis, which is really, Susan Wagle and Jim Denning against the world at this point. I mean, you saw last night, so they passed a budget, and just on 63 votes, a lot of, they said, like, the House said, we refuse to vote on a budget until the Senate passes Medicaid expansion. And in response, the Speaker and the House leadership went and they made a revenge budget. They were like, we're going to cut the higher education funds, we're going to cut some like family programs, some health programs, and they came back and they thought that this was going to punish people into doing it, and instead it went from 63 votes against the budget to 81 votes against the budget. I mean, they managed to, pardon my language, they like really pissed off. Even the base, like even their conservative base was really angry about this, and there were all these threats going around, and I mean, there's basically no confidence right now in the legislature in their leadership. Kind of like a sad clap, right? I don't know where we're at with that. We'll see.
For 21 years, and one of the people I was following, I'm Leslie Mark, I'm very much a League of Women Voters person, but I also run Indivisible KC on the Kansas side, and we had major fun with the tweets last night, but one of the things I wanted to call out is that you had principled conservatives who principally stood up and said, this is insane. He drove a school bus for 21 years, and he knows bullying when he sees it. But if you want to go on live on the Kansas legislature page and click on the audio video, you don't have to wait for Davis's meticulously edited, beautiful pieces of video. You can watch this stuff live, and I highly recommend it from time to time, maybe not at 10 p.m. on a Friday night. But, so I just want to say, your point is well taken, Davis, that these local legislators, even when we disagree with them in many places, you can find agreement with them and you can hear really democracy in action. And that's the story that you need to lift up to neighbors, right? We in Johnson County live in a pretty amazing place where we have a lot of cooperation in our delegation. and the Northeast Johnson County, and there are groups that work with them. So, it could be a Northeast Johnson County chamber or one of the city chambers, but stay engaged with it, even though it's difficult to understand, and then go back and listen to loud light videos to make you understand what you really heard.
Folks, we have time for only one more question, and it's going to be over here, please. Thank you.
Two parts to it. Is Wyandotte County over 125,000? And do we
Yes.
have, so we have an appointed
Yes, you're an
person.
appointed
Okay.
election commissioner.
And secondly, is there a trend statewide to close precinct polling places? I was a poll watcher for the ACLU at my local one, and I noticed it was the place to vote for about 7 different precincts. And I just think that I had friends, who lived 5 blocks from me. The church right by them used to always be their polling place and isn't anymore. People downtown, it's a poorer part of the city, and I think they would have trouble if they didn't have transportation.
So how many precinct places you have, how many polling places you have really? So precincts are set by the state, but then how many precincts all go to the same polling place? That's up to your elections commissioner. So, and it varies, again, it varies so much. There are some counties that you go and everyone's within a short walking distance to their polling place, and you have stuff like we all saw in Ford County where all of the city of Dodge has one polling place, right? And it's outside of town. So it is completely up to your elections commissioner how they do that and how they set those, and they can also vary election to election, which can be really confusing. Like their logic is, in a local election, fewer people vote, we're going to have fewer polling places. And then they even have, fewer polling places for midterm elections than for general elections. And then they also all vary on how they do early voting. For example, Shawnee County, where I'm from, we're the only large county that doesn't do weekend early voting. We don't have one day a week in early voting. So that is completely up to your elections commissioner. It is the kind of weird dynamic for election commissioners and county clerks are the county actually pays for the elections. So we have a weird system where it's not like a top down. It's not like you pay your tax dollars, it goes to the Secretary of State, and they allocate these funds to run it. County by county, your county commission can actually have a huge impact on how your elections are run because they decide if they allocate money. And in Shawnee County, we had this big war that happened basically where they reduced the pay of our elections commissioner because he was asking for more funds for programs to punish him. But more polling sites cost more money, and if the county commission doesn't want to allocate that money, then it's just not possible. So you actually see this weird standoff sometimes between county clerks, election officials, and the county commission that doesn't want to pay for elections.